There is a place, forgotten by time, nestled within the dense, ancient woods beyond the old stone bridge of Merrow's Hollow. Few speak of it now, for the years have folded over its memory like layers of mist, blurring the lines between fact and superstition. She told me of the girl named Eleonora, who once lived there, long before my grandmother's grandmother was born. The air held a weight to it, dense with the scent of damp earth and old, decaying things. During harvest season, when the days shortened and night crept in like a cold hand around the throat, strange figures were glimpsed between the trees. Ivy clawed at its frame, the roof sagged, and windows grew blind with grime. The forest, too, seemed to swallow it, drawing the trees close like jealous sentinels. And yet, on certain nights when the mist curled low and the air hummed with the memory of lost things, a faint light would return to its solitary window, a pull, gentle as the tide, urging me toward that forgotten path. Time had gnawed at its bones. The wood silvered and split, the roof caved in upon one side, but the window remained, a single, unbroken pane of glass, smeared with the dust of decades, and in its heart a light, flickering, weak, as though fighting to exist against the suffocating dark. Hair long and unkempt, spilling over her shoulders like dark silk, her back was to me, face turned toward the night beyond the glass. She did not move, yet the air around her shimmered with a restless, unnameable tension. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words dissolved upon my tongue, swallowed by the suffocating hush. The sun, already low, painted the sky in dying hues of copper and ash. But curiosity is a quiet tyrant, and I crossed the threshold with the slow, hesitant tread of one stepping through a dream. But the pull of that ancient sorrow, the aching loneliness that hung about her like a shroud, struck some chord within me. I stepped closer, the floor protesting beneath my weight. "The promise," she murmured. "He said he'd return. He promised." The air inside was thick with the scent of earth and mildew. Moonlight pooled through the ruined roof, illuminating motes of dust that danced like spirits caught in some eternal waltz. And then, softly, so softly I doubted the sound was real, she spoke. He came. The candle flickered, casting fleeting shadows across her face, and in that moment, I understood. The stories were wrong. She was not a harbinger of death, nor a vengeful spirit chained to grief. She was simply waiting. The forest loomed, its branches gnarled and reaching like withered fingers. I walked alone, though the hairs at the nape of my neck prickled, as though unseen eyes traced my every step. The path narrowed, choked by roots and the unkind touch of brambles, and the world grew still. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir, a flickering, desperate glow, as though someone or something still waited there. Not beasts, not quite men. Pale, yes, but in the way of one long removed from sun and warmth. Her eyes were wide, dark as stormlit seas, and in them a sorrow so deep it seemed to eclipse the world. The children of the village dared one another to approach it after sundown. None did. Travelers, those unaware of the old ways, spoke of seeing a pale figure at the window, her hair dark and tangled, eyes gleaming in the half-light. But by the time anyone reached the clearing, there was only the empty house, sagging and silent, and the oppressive stillness that weighed heavier than night itself. And it was then that Eleonora vanished. Superstition, after all, is a fragile thing, easily broken by the harsh daylight of rational thought. Yet it lingers, always, in the spaces between words, in the hush that falls over a room when certain subjects are broached. I was no different. I told myself stories, dismissed the old tales as the desperate fictions of fading minds, but some part of me, some small, unreasoning fragment. Eleonora was not like the other children of the village. She spoke rarely, walked with a peculiar grace, and kept to the edges of gatherings, as though the world weighed heavy upon her narrow shoulders. They said her eyes were too wide, too knowing for a child, and that she spent her evenings beneath the great oak, speaking softly to shadows that answered only in the rustling of leaves. But ask the oldest soul in the village, those with eyes that have seen too many winters, and they will lower their voice, glance warily at the thickening tree line, and whisper of the house, a house of wood, aged and bleached by countless seasons, standing lonesome beneath a twisted, dying oak. It was sharp, thin, and so full of terror that even the hounds refused to answer. No one went to her aid. Not then, It was only when dawn reluctantly pried its way through the fog that the villagers ventured toward the house. They found no sign of the girl. The floorboards bore no disturbance. Her small belongings, few and worn, sat untouched upon a crooked shelf. Yet the scent of wildflowers lingered, unnatural and cloying, as though someone had scattered them fresh. It is said that when dusk settles, and the last of the sun's warmth bleeds from the earth, a faint, flickering light appears in its window, though no living soul has claimed its hearth for over a century. I first learned of it from my grandmother, a brittle woman of 93 years, when she last spoke of such things. The forest, you see, was alive in ways the people of Morose Hollow feared to name. On the eve of the harvest moon, long after the village had shuttered its windows and bolted its doors, a single scream split the night air. They searched the woods for days, but Eleonora was gone, and the house, once dimly tethered to life, began its slow surrender to decay. It became a quiet, persistent legend. For many years, no one spoke of it openly. It was on a chill evening in late autumn, when the harvest fields lay bare and the last of the crows abandoned the trees, that I felt it. At last, I saw it. The house, smaller than I had imagined, slumped beneath the oak's heavy boughs. My pulse thudded in my ears. I should have turned back. Every story, every warning, urged me away. And then I saw her. A figure, slender and still, stood by the window. It was not until she raised one hand, palm pressed against the cold glass, that I found my voice. The name felt strange, ancient, a relic from a world not my own. Yet at its sound, she turned. Her face was not what I expected. Not the hollow-eyed wraith of childhood tales, nor the ghastly spectre of fevered dreams. She was young. She regarded me in silence, as though measuring the weight of centuries in a single gaze. The room seemed to constrict, the walls pressing close, as though the house itself drew breath. For what, or whom, I did not yet know. "Why are you here?" I whispered. She turned her gaze back to the window, to the darkened forest beyond. And then, as the last light of day surrendered to the encroaching dark, the candle guttered, and the room was plunged into shadow. I do not remember how long I stood there in that dim, collapsing room, watching as the last flicker of the candle's flame surrendered to the dark. The air thickened, oppressive, filled with a hush so absolute that it seemed to absorb even the sound of my own breathing. And yet, though the shadows stretched and shifted, the pale figure by the window did not vanish. She remained, a slender silhouette outlined by the faint light of the rising moon. Her hand still pressed against the glass, as though it tethered her to this crumbling world. Outside, the forest had transformed. What daylight left behind as mere trees and thickets now became an endless tapestry of restless shapes. The wind stirred the branches, and they spoke in a tongue older than words, whispering secrets meant for no living ear. I wanted to leave. Every instinct, every ancient, half-remembered tale of things, best left undisturbed, clawed at the edges of my mind. But there was something about her presence, a quiet desolation, a loneliness so profound it seemed to bleed into the walls, into the very air. And though I did not know her, though the centuries stretched like a chasm between us, I could not abandon her to that eternal waiting. I drew a breath, the scent of earth and old wood sharp in my lungs. "Who promised you?" I asked, though my voice felt brittle, a thing too fragile for the suffocating hush of that room. She did not turn this time, but her reflection in the cracked window shifted, the pale outline of her face marked by sorrow. "He was a traveler," she murmured, her voice little more than the sigh of forgotten leaves. "A man from beyond the hills. He came with the autumn rains, spoke words I had never heard, of places far from these woods. He said he would take me away, when the harvest moon hung full in the sky." There was a tremor in her words, a yearning stretched thin by time. But he left, as they always do. A single tear tracked down her cheek, catching the ghostly light like a tiny star. I felt the weight of her grief, not as a stranger's pain, but as something intimate, familiar, as though the room itself mourned with her. "And you waited," I whispered. She nodded, her hair brushing against her shoulders, a cascade of dark silk dulled by years of dust and shadow. "Every year, on the night of the harvest moon, I light the candle. I wait by the window, and still he does not come." The wind outside rose, a long, low lament that pressed against the walls of the house. I glanced toward the doorway, where the darkness pooled thick and formless, then back to her. "Why stay? Why not let go? A long silence followed, so profound it seemed the world itself held its breath. Then, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, she answered, "Because in the promise there is hope. And hope, even when betrayed, is a fragile, stubborn thing." Her words settled over me like frost. I thought of my own life, the people I had lost, the broken vows, the silences that lingered in empty rooms, the ache of things unfinished, words unsaid. Perhaps that was what bound us both to this moment. I stepped closer, the floor groaning underfoot, and though part of me feared she might dissolve like mist, she remained. The candle's wick still smouldered faintly, a slender thread of smoke curling into the dark. "Do you know his name?" I asked. She shook her head. I only knew his face, and the way his voice made the world seem larger than these woods. She lowered her hand, and for the first time, faced me fully. In her eyes, I saw not the horror I had feared, but an endless, aching solitude. She was no ghost spun from malice, no restless spirit seeking vengeance. She was simply forgotten. And in that forgetting unmoored, "Perhaps," I said carefully, "you waited long enough." The words hung between us, heavy as old sorrow. For a moment, I thought she might weep, but instead, a faint smile touched the corners of her lips. It was a fragile thing, the barest ghost of warmth. "Would you stay until dawn?" The question was spoken as though it cost her the last of her strength, and in that instant, I understood what it was she feared most. Not death, not oblivion, but the slow erosion of memory, of being left behind by a world that no longer spoke her name. I nodded. "I will stay." The room did not change. The house did not brighten, nor did the oppressive weight lift from the air. But something eased within her gaze, as though the centuries fell away, if only by a fraction. She turned back to the window, and I moved to sit upon the old, dust-choked floor. The hours stretched long. The night outside thickened. The woods groaned and whispered, ancient trees leaning close to share their secrets. And within that ruined house, two figures sat in silence, the living and the forgotten, neither speaking, neither needing. The moon rose high, its pale light washing over the clearing, and somewhere deep within the forest, a shape moved, half seen a figure too distant to know. Yet in that moment, a new flicker of hope kindled in her eyes, and I, though knowing better, chose to believe it too. The night wore on in that small, decaying room, and the line between hours blurred. Time stretched and thinned, pulling itself into long, silken strands that unraveled at the edges of my awareness. I could no longer say how long we sat there, her form half-lit by the pallid glow of the rising moon, my own breath misting faintly in the cold, heavy air. The world beyond those walls shrank to a hushed, intimate space occupied by two quiet figures, one waiting for the dawn, the other for something far older and more uncertain. Outside, the wind had grown restless. It pressed against the warped boards, carrying with it the soft, mournful sigh of the forest. Leaves skittered against the glass, and in the distance, an owl called once, its voice thin and lonely. I found myself watching the pale figure beside me, noting the way the faint light caught in her hair, the delicate curve of her fingers as they brushed idly against the windowsill. She seemed less ghostly now, less the wraith of old stories, and more, a young woman trapped in the vast, echoing corridors of memory. I wondered what it must have been like, those first nights after she was left behind, the disbelief turning to hope, then to fear, and finally to this aching threadbare patience that had carried her through uncounted years. At last, she spoke again, her voice so quiet it seemed more thought than sound. "They stopped speaking of me, didn't they?" I hesitated, then nodded, though she never turned her gaze from the window. "Long ago," I admitted. "The old ones still remember, but most, they forget, as people do." A soft, bitter smile touched her lips, though it carried no malice. "That is the way of things," she murmured. "Names fade, faces blur, promises unravel like smoke." She fell silent once more, and I could feel the weight of those centuries pressing in around us. Yet in that oppressive hush, there was a strange comfort, a kinship born of our mutual smallness in the face of time's relentless tide. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the cadence of the wind, the sigh of the old house as it settled upon its bones, and then a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps upon frost-hardened earth. My eyes snapped open. She stiffened beside me, her head tilting slightly, as though catching a half-forgotten melody carried upon the wind. The forest outside was a tangle of shifting shadow and brittle, skeletal branches, yet through them a figure moved, a man, tall and narrow-shouldered, clothed in garments too old for this world, their edges frayed by years of unseen travel. His face was indistinct, veiled by both distance and mist, but something in his bearing spoke of weary purpose. The girl beside me rose, a fragile, trembling thing made of memory and sorrow. Her lips parted, and for the first time I heard her speak his name, a word worn thin with longing. It was not a cry, not a plea, but a breath shaped by centuries of waiting. I remained still, my own pulse, a slow, dull drum in my ears. The figure did not hurry, nor did he falter. Step by step, he crossed the clearing, each footfall a soft imprint upon the frost. And as he drew closer, the moonlight revealed the lines etched into his face, the shadow of grief that hung about him like a tattered cloak. He was no spirit, no shade conjured by the girl's desperate hope. He was flesh and blood, aged and diminished by the years, but undeniably real. I could see it in the way his breath plumed in the cold, in the slight hitch of his gait. The impossible truth settled over me like snow. Somehow, impossibly, he had returned. The girl's face crumpled, joy and sorrow warring within her as he came to stand at the threshold of the ruined house. Neither spoke for a long, aching moment. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached into the folds of his coat and withdrew a small object, a delicate pendant of simple, weathered silver. I recognized it at once from the stories my grandmother had told, a charm in the shape of a twisted knot, worn to ward off ill fate. He held it out to her, and his voice, cracked with age, barely carried to where I sat. "I promised," he said. The words hung in the air, brittle and uncertain, yet they held a weight that no distance of years could diminish. She stepped forward, and for the first time, the frost receded beneath her feet, as though the world itself acknowledged the long-denied reunion. Their hands met, and in that brief contact, the years seemed to collapse, folding in upon themselves like the petals of a withered bloom. The house shuddered once, the ancient timbers groaning as though releasing a final, burdened breath, and then the light shifted, the moon's pale glow softened, the oppressive weight in the air lifted, and somewhere in the woods, the first tentative notes of a bird's song broke the hush. Dawn, timid and grey, pressed against the horizon. The man and the girl stood together for a moment longer, their figures framed by the silvered window. She smiled, a true, unburdened thing. And as the first light of morning touched her face, her form began to fade, not in horror, not in despair, but like mist returning to the earth. He bowed his head, clutching the pendant to his chest, and turned away from the house. I watched as he retraced his steps, the forest parting for him, the path clear where before it had been lost to bramble and thorn. The girl's voice lingered, a whisper upon the dawn, "Thank you." And then there was only silence. The ruined house stood empty, the candle long cold, the window's glass catching the morning light in fractured, gentle hues. I rose, feeling the weight of the night's impossible truth settle into the marrow of my bones. I left the house as the sun crept higher, the frost melting to dew, and the forest no longer seemed so hostile. The old stories had been wrong. The ghost had not waited for vengeance, nor sought to drag the living down into the cold earth. She had waited for a promise to be kept, and now, at last, she could rest. The walk back to the village was a long, quiet thing. The path, once tangled and forgotten, now lay open before me, cleared by some unseen will or perhaps by the simple weight of what had passed. The trees no longer leaned so heavily, nor did the branches clutch at my sleeves as they had when I first made the journey into that ancient, restless wood. Morning light filtered through the thinning canopy, catching on the last of the autumn leaves as they drifted down in slow, lazy spirals. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, the faint tolling of a bell marked the hour. I felt as though I walked not in the world of the living, nor entirely in that of the dead, but in a narrow space between, a hush that clung to me like mist. The events of the night pressed upon my mind, though not with the sharp terror I might have expected. There was no lingering dread, no cold weight of some malevolent presence following in my shadow. Instead, there remained only a strange, bittersweet ache, as though a story long left unfinished had at last found its ending, leaving behind the quiet melancholy of closure. I passed the old stone bridge as the first true warmth of the day touched the hills beyond, and the village stirred with the sounds of morning. Smoke curled from chimneys, the bark of a distant dog echoed against the hills, and figures moved slowly through the fields, heads bent to their work. Life, in its patient, indifferent way, resumed. And yet, to my eyes, everything seemed subtly altered. The faces of those I passed carried the same lines, the same expressions of care and fatigue, but behind them lay the unspoken sense that something had shifted. A pressure eased, a long-held breath released. I made my way to the small inn at the village's heart, its weathered sign creaking gently in the breeze. The keeper, a stout, grey-bearded man named Bram, greeted me with a wary glance, his eyes flicking to the leaves clinging to my coat, the damp on my boots. "Out early," he remarked, voice low as though reluctant to disturb the fragile peace of the morning. I nodded, lacking the words to explain where I had been or what I had seen. There were no names left for such things, no tidy explanations that could be traded across a bar or beside a hearth. Some stories, I had learned, belonged to the spaces between words. He poured me a cup of something hot and strong, and as I took the seat nearest the fire, a strange hush settled over the room. The other patrons, a few farmhands, an elderly woman spinning yarn, avoided my gaze, not in malice, nor in suspicion, but in quiet recognition. For though none had followed me into the woods, though no one had stood in that ruined house as dawn broke, they knew, or at least they sensed. Villages like Merrow's Hollow held such knowledge in their bones, passed not through stories spoken aloud, but in the subtle shifting of glances, in the way certain paths were left untraveled, certain names unspoken. I sat in silence, nursing the warmth between my hands, and listened as the sounds of the village life returned, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the murmur of traders setting their stalls. Outside, the morning brightened, children's laughter mingled with the clink of tools, and the world carried on, as it always does. Yet some part of me remained tethered to that clearing, to the memory of a girl whose name had long since slipped from common speech, and the man who had crossed impossible distances to keep a promise. It would have been easy to let the memory fade, to let it dissolve into the half-forgotten tapestry of old tales, filed away beside other half-believed things. But in the quiet moments, when dusk gathered and the wind spoke in the old language through the branches, I would remember. And perhaps that was enough. The weeks passed, and the forest began its slow retreat into winter. The leaves turned brittle, the earth hardened beneath frost, and the nights grew long once more. I walked the lanes as I always had, spoke with neighbors, shared in harvest feasts and winter fires. And yet, every so often, as dusk fell and the mists coiled in the hollows of the land, I would see it, a single, flickering light in the distance, far beyond the edge of the fields, where no house should stand, a pale, trembling glow, stubborn against the encroaching dark. I never followed it again. Some things, I had come to understand, are not meant to be pursued twice, not for fear, but for respect. The dead, when given peace, should not be disturbed, and the living must learn to carry certain memories, like old songs, half remembered, bittersweet, and sacred. And so the seasons turned, and Merrow's Hollow endured. Children grew, old men passed, fields were sown and reaped. The stories grew fainter, the names forgotten. But on nights when the harvest moon hung full and heavy in the sky, those with hearts attuned to such things might yet sense it, a soft hum in the air, the faint scent of wildflowers, where none should bloom, and a single flickering light at the edge of the old wood keeping its quiet vigil, waiting, not for sorrow, not for vengeance, but for remembrance. And in the hush between one breath and the next, the old house, though long crumbled to earth and root, would rise once more in the minds of those who dared recall its name, a place of endings and of kept promises, a name spoken only in silence. The house at the edge of the forgotten woods. Years passed, as they always do. The faces of Merrow's Hollow changed, old names slipped from memory, and new ones took their place. The lanes remained the same, winding like pale threads through fields and woodlands, but the stories shifted, softened, worn thin by time and disuse. The old ones who had once spoken in hushed voices of things glimpsed at dusk were gone now, their wisdom buried beneath weathered stones at the edge of the churchyard. The children of the village no longer feared the old forest in the way their grandparents had. They roamed its edges in careless groups, chasing one another beneath the tangled branches, heedless of the places where the ground grew cold and the air turned thick with the scent of earth and rot. And yet, some shadows linger, even when no one remembers to name them. I was older now, my hair touched with grey, my hands bearing the quiet ache of seasons past. The old path through the woods had long been overgrown, the house itself reduced to little more than a sagging skeleton of wood and stone, choked by ivy and earth. Nature, as always, sought to reclaim what had been abandoned, but on certain nights, when the wind moved in a particular way and the mist rose thick over the fields, a light would still appear at the edge of the trees. It was a frail thing, a faint glow that flickered and danced just beyond the reach of reason. The new villagers spoke of it rarely. When they did, it was with the half-dismissive tone reserved for old wives' tales, a trick of the light, a wandering lantern caught in the branches. But deep down, in the marrow of their bones, they felt it. The old fear, the knowledge that some places in this world remember what others have forgotten. It was on such a night, when the air was thick with fog and the moon hung low like a bruised coin in the sky, that a stranger arrived in Merrow's Hollow. He came by the old North Road, his face half hidden by the brim of a weather-stained hat, a long coat trailing behind him like a faded shadow. Few noticed his arrival, fewer still saw the way his gaze lingered upon the dark line of the forest, as though measuring the weight of its silence. He asked no questions of the townsfolk, sought no room at the inn. Instead, as dusk fell, he made his way toward the woods, moving with the sure, quiet tread of one who walked familiar ground. I watched from the doorway of my small cottage, a strange unease stirring in the pit of my stomach. There was something in the way he carried himself, a sense of old sorrow, of unfinished things. Though his features were unfamiliar, the shape of his grief was not. The woods swallowed him quickly, the mist curling in his wake. I told myself to leave it be. The dead had found their rest, the story had ended, there was no reason to follow. And yet, the memory of that long-ago night, of a girl's pale face framed by moonlight and sorrow, rose unbidden in my mind. I gathered my coat and lantern and stepped into the chill. The path was harder to find now, choked by undergrowth and the slow, steady crawl of the earth's reclaiming hand. But my feet remembered. The way was etched into my bones, into the map of old fears and older promises. The woods greeted me with the same hush as before, though now it felt less oppressive, more as though the land itself held its breath. I found him standing at the clearing's edge, where the bones of the old house still clung to one another in fragile defiance. The walls had crumbled further, the window frames now little more than splinters. Yet even in ruin, the place retained its hold upon the world. The stranger stood motionless, his head bowed, a small object held between his hands. I stepped closer, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves. "You shouldn't be here," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He did not turn, but his voice when it came was quiet and worn thin by time. Some debts aren't paid in a single lifetime. I saw then what he held, a silver pendant, tarnished with age, the same simple knotwork design I had once seen pressed into a trembling palm so many years before. My heart tightened, understanding blooming slow and cold within me. "You knew her," I murmured. He nodded. "In another life, in a story long buried." The air shifted then, the mist curling low, and a faint light flared within the ruin. Not a trick of the eye this time, a true, steady glow, soft and warm, as though a hearth fire still burned somewhere within those collapsed walls. I saw her, just for a moment, a figure standing where no one should be, her hair loose and dark, her face turned toward the stranger with something like peace in her eyes. No sorrow now, no waiting, only recognition. The stranger stepped forward and placed the pendant upon the weathered stone. "I kept the promise," he said. The light flickered once, then steadied, and for the first time in countless years, the clearing felt whole. The weight lifted, the hush broke, and the woods exhaled a long-held breath. The figure faded, the glow receding into the bones of the earth, and the stranger turned to me, his face lined with years I could not begin to number. "Tell them," he said, "so it isn't forgotten." And then he was gone, swallowed by the mist, leaving only the scent of wildflowers and the lingering warmth of a story finished at last. I stood in the clearing until dawn, the first notes of birdsong breaking the night's hold, and when I left, I carried with me the shape of that promise, a thread woven into the fabric of a world that seldom remembers its ghosts. But I would remember, and in the telling, so would others. The years pressed onward as relentless as the tide, and I felt their slow, steady erosion in the stiff ache of my hands in the way. The cold seemed to cling more tightly to my bones with each passing winter. Maros Hollow changed, as all places must. New faces arrived, young families from towns beyond the hills, drawn by the quiet fields and the promise of land left untamed. The old names faded from the ledgers, their letters soft and worn, while unfamiliar ones took root like pale new shoots upon the soil. The forest, too, shifted. The paths I once walked so easily vanished beneath thick undergrowth, trees reclaiming the spaces where memory had once held sway. The house, or what remained of it, sank deeper into the earth, the stones scattered, the last timbers swallowed by moss and ivy. Only I, it seemed, remembered. I spoke little of it in those later years. The world had grown louder, hungrier for simpler stories, and the tale of a girl in a ruined house, and a promise stretched across lifetimes, no longer fit within its narrow appetites. But sometimes on cold evenings, when the mist lay thick upon the ground and the wind stirred the trees to restless whispering, a traveller at the inn would ask of strange lights seen beyond the fields, or of the ruins half hidden in the woods. I would lean closer then, my voice lowering to that old, familiar hush, and I would tell them, not the full story. No, some things belonged to the hush between breaths, but enough so that when they left Maros Hollow, they would carry with them a fragment of it, a pale thread of memory trailing behind like mist upon the heather. And though many forgot, as people always do, some did not. I saw it in the way a boy paused at the edge of the old path one evening, his gaze fixed upon a place where no light should be, or in the quiet hush that settled over the market square, when an autumn wind carried with it the faint, impossible scent of wildflowers long out of season. In those moments, I knew the story lingered, not in books, not in the brittle memories of crumbling gravestones, but in the marrow of the place itself. Time, for all its hunger, cannot swallow everything. It was late in my final winter, the days short and brittle, the nights long and thick with frost, when I felt the pull again. Not a sharp, sudden thing, but a gentle, persistent ache, as though a half-forgotten voice were calling me home. I knew the forest would be near impassable now, but the years had taken enough from me. I would not allow them to steal this last journey. I left before dawn, a walking stick in hand, my steps slow but steady. The land remembered me. The trees leaned aside as they had in younger years, the mist curling low around my feet. The path found me rather than the other way around, its shape marked not by earth and stone, but by memory. And when I reached the clearing, I found it changed, yet unchanged. No trace of the house remained, the earth smooth and unbroken save for a ring of ancient stones, half sunken and slick with moss. In their center, a single bloom had risen, delicate and pale, a wild flower that should not have endured the frost. I knew then, knew in the way of old men who have carried certain truths too long, that this was no accident. The stories had finished their telling, the old promises kept, and yet some echoes refused to fade. I knelt, my bones protesting, and placed my hand upon the earth. The ground was cold, but not empty. It hummed with a quiet, familiar presence, the kind that exists only in places where the world has grown thin. The wind rose, carrying with it a single, whispered word, a name I had not heard spoken aloud in half a century. I smiled then, a quiet, tired thing, and closed my eyes. The cold no longer bit so sharply. The ache in my chest, long a constant companion, eased, and for the first time in many years, I felt whole. I do not remember the walk home, if indeed I made it at all. Perhaps I remained there, a pale figure seated upon the frost-laced stones, keeping silent company with the ghosts of stories long since told. The villagers found my cottage empty some days later. The fire had burned down to ash, a cup of tea gone cold beside my chair. They said I must have wandered into the woods and been lost to the snow. The young ones whispered that the light in the trees had returned that night, flickering like a single, stubborn star. And perhaps it did. Perhaps it always will. For places like Maros Hollow do not forget their dead, not entirely. And in the hush of certain evenings when the mist curls low and the wind sings in the old tongue, you might still hear the soft tread of footsteps on leaf-strewn paths, the murmur of a name carried upon the dark. And somewhere, at the edge of a clearing where no house now stands, a lone, flickering light keeps its watch, waiting, as it always has, for the next soul to remember.